All right, I guess we could get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Our speaker for our next presentation is Dr. Mai Phan, who is a data expert consultant currently supporting Toronto Police Service's groundbreaking anti-racism initiative. Mai works collaboratively with colleagues and partners to promote an evidence-based approach to anti-racism, human rights, and inclusion in public service organizations. Mai was also a senior research and policy advisor at the Anti-Racism Directorate. She led the development and establishment of the anti-racism data standards and provided strategic advice and support to public sector organizations regulated to collect race-based data under the Anti-Racism Act. She contributed to the development of the Systemic Racial Barrier Identification and Removal Program to support advancement of workplace racial equity and inclusion with Ontario Public Service. Prior to that, Mai was a human rights advisor in the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. Mai supported initiatives to address systemic discrimination and remove barriers in employment and service delivery in correctional services. Please welcome Dr. Mai Phan, who will be presenting on race data as an anti-racism tool.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you everyone for joining this session. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and to share some of the things I've learned over the years in my work to promote the collection of race-based data, but also how to use data to address systemic inequities. So in this talk, we're going to look at race as a concept, race as a set of relationships, and race as a structure. If we're serious about addressing inequities in our society, including addressing systemic racism and how to build a more fair, sustainable, and healthy present and future for everyone, then we need to understand how race came to be encoded in all of our social systems, in our infrastructures and technologies, and how to use race to decode those systemic biases. So while this talk focuses specifically on race and race-based data, anything that we discuss can be applied to gender oppression, oppressions and disparities along disabilities, along age differences, and all of those other aspects of systemic barriers that we experience and exist in our systems, including economic inequality. So what does this have to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning and all the cool stuff that you guys do and build in your work? Well, data is everywhere and underpins so much of our technological and digital tools that we increasingly rely on to make policies and to make decisions, both large and small. But data is not merely a technical matter, and this is where I really want to emphasize in this talk. It is inherently and deeply social and political endeavor. So to understand race as a modern idea and to understand how it came to be so deeply rooted as it is, we need to reach back in history and consider how race as a social construct evolved over time and within a very specific context. Modern ideas of race and racism are the products of the Enlightenment thinkers. Thinkers between 16 to 1800s drew from existing ideas already at play in European society. So the distinctions between civilized versus barbarism from the Greeks, ideas about anti-Semitism and essentialized characteristics of Jewish people in Europe really were the seeds that came to formulate new theories of race that at the time served European monarchs in their drive for economic gain and power around the world. And then it was used to justify systems of exploitation and domination in the New World. It was deeply self-serving, and it functioned to resolve several contradictions at the time. So when we think about the Enlightenment, we think of several ideas that we generally associated to philosophers such as John Locke, Immanuel Kant, etc. Ideas around reason and science, around natural rights, individual liberty, and the rule of law, and emerging ideas about capitalism and economic systems. But alongside with those developments and emerging ideas, there were also emerging ideas around racial taxonomies. So parallel to the interest in the science and the scientific revolution at the time, there was this interest in how to categorize and make sense of the world. And that included human populations. And so pseudo-scientific ideas of racial differences based on physical, taxonomies and classifications of humankind boiled down to its essential differences. Really drove the thinking behind social Darwinism and scientific racism. We had emerging ideas around five types of humans. Count them on your hands. A theory of racial differences. And then we also had ideas of absolute rights emerging at the same time as natural rights. Natural rights being, everyone has essential human dignity that is inherent in us as human beings. But then absolute rights, being used first to challenge the monarchy and the absolute rights of monarchs, but reserving that idea to protect the rights of slave owners to have absolute power and authority over their slaves. And this was advocated by John Locke, who while advocating for individual liberty and natural rights in his thinking when it relates to European society, reserved and argued for the absolute rights of slave owners when he was contributing to the fundamental Constitution of the Carolinas in the US. The idea of chattel slavery, up until the Enlightenment times was not a new thing, but you could work your way out of slavery. And it wasn't attached to your body and to skin color and to whole peoples indefinitely. But the idea of chattel slavery really changed that. And so the association and the enslavement of persons with Black skins became embedded and coded into systems in the US that we're familiar with, but also existed in Canada and is often erased in our history. And so these Enlightenment ideas really created a schematic for thinking about peoples, whole peoples. This was bolstered by technological developments in shipbuilding at the time, navigation and visual media like the camera, which exposed Europeans to very different world populations, without having to travel through the regions and seeing gradual changes in cultures and peoples, and appreciating the rich diversity of human beings. Oops, sorry. In that process. So by being able to skip all that and traveling long distances between areas of the world, and they started to notice stark differences between people, and so that really colored their perception of human diversity. So instead of understanding and having appreciation of the rainbow of human diversity, it really crystallized in scientific thought this idea that there were five or a handful of distinct human populations. And so this idea of race really became to be embedded and encoded into how we understood and shaped our social realities. And again, it was for a very specific purpose, and it served very well to justify Europeans' drive for colonial expansion, imperial expansion to extract resources around the world, different areas of the world. It served as justification for exploiting and dominating over other peoples. So in essence, for over 300 years, race and racism operated essentially as an algorithm that influences decisions about people's opportunities and freedoms, access to resources, and also influenced their everyday experiences. It was an algorithm that was performed by our wetwares, our brains, right? It relies on the imperfect, incomplete, and ad hoc information that we have access to as limited human beings, trying to make sense of the world and acting upon it and shaping our realities in that process. So let's look at how race data was constructed and collected in the Canadian context in Canada over time, and what that reveals about our beliefs, our worldviews about people, and the assumptions that are embedded in it. So by being attentive to how data are collected in relation to race and ethnic origin, it helps us to understand what it means before we use it uncritically. And it helps us to be critical about the data. So the historical practices of collecting race data has existed in Canadian official statistics since the beginning of the founding of Canada as a nation, and even prior to that, when Canada was a colony of Britain and France. And it reflects official thinking about race and racial difference, and the state's interest in defining and describing the population in a certain way. So I'll give you some examples, and I'll start from Confederation, around the time of Confederation, where you had the census being taken of Canadian society at the time, and there were they collected information about a place of birth. So you had all the European places of birth, and then you had a separate category: colored person or Indian, if any. So it really reveals the interest of bureaucrats at the time to make that distinction and highlight and make visible those who were not white and those who were Indian, if any, in the territory that's being surveyed. And then in 1971, this was rolled into a bigger category called origin, simply labeled origin. And then, the census takers would then identify all the European origins in fine detail, but then colored person and Indian. So it was really a signifier of not being white. And it really highlighted the centrality of whiteness in Canada at the time. Fast forward a little bit to 1901, where Statistics Canada, at the time, the equivalent, collected on a characteristic that they labeled color. So it's flat out, very transparent. They were interested in race. And 4 categories that were collected about the population was white, black, yellow, and red. I kid you not. This is part of our historical census. Then we had in 1931, remember this was a time prior to the end of World War II, but World War II was certainly in motion with not the war, but the Third Reich in Germany and all the unrest in Europe around that. And the interest had expanded to unpack color to capture who was Chinese, who was Japanese, Negro emerges here, as well as Jewish and Native Indian, picked out among those who were with non-white, non-European origins. And the category was labeled racial origins. So they really had a racialized thinking about groups, and it was mucky, and it was messy, and it was merged in with European ethno-cultural origin as well, even though the language used was race. And then in 1971, we had ethnic origin. This racial origin was replaced with ethnic origin. For the first time, it was collected and allowed for multiple selection. So prior to 1971, census takers would only take your origins based on your father's origin, not your mother. So it reflected a patrilineal logic. Except, and there's always exceptions made here, and it's very revealing, those exceptions, except if you were not white and not European origin. If you were not white, then your racial category was based on your mother's. And that's really, that's a very interesting exception, and it reveals what we were the thinking at the time in terms of when patrilineal makes sense and when does matrilineal make sense, and why. And if you think of the policies at that time around around racialized peoples, around Indigenous and Black populations, it reflects a dominance of whiteness. And if you had a non-white, it would be based on whatever your mother's was. It reflected a practice where often it was white European men who would pair up with non-white women. After 1980, after 1971, for Indigenous peoples, this flipped back to the father's side. So this reflected the changes to the Indian Act and who counted as Indigenous and who didn't. And if you had a white and non-white background, like I was saying, it was whoever had the non-white, whichever parent who was not white. That's how you would be classified. We had, in 1981, you started to see concepts like visible minority emerge. And then Aboriginal was introduced as a separate category. And in the introduction of Aboriginal as a separate category, the data, the official statistics created a blind spot. If you were Aboriginal, for example, you would skip the questions around your racial background, your visible minority status. So in the statistics that remain today, and this is a practice that remains today, the skip logic for Indigenous populations meant that there's no way that the official statistics can tell us and help us know about people who have both Indigenous backgrounds and identify as Indigenous, and who may be racialized in different ways. So this has implications in Ontario, where we have a sizable population of persons who identify as both Black and Indigenous, who have both backgrounds. And we know from the history, and which we'll get to later, that this double whammy of systemic racism, historical trauma of being both Black and Indigenous in a colonial settler society like ours has huge impacts for that population. But we don't know that, and we can't know it because of the way statistics are collected currently. So that's race as concept. Now we get to those concepts help to define a set of relationships that are inherently unequal. And they serve purposes that were designed to be that way. So racial categorization by the state has historically shaped the legal rights, opportunities, and outcomes of both Indigenous peoples and Black peoples in Canada, as well as other racialized communities in Canada. The shadows of slavery can be seen in the systemic anti-Black racism that exists today. The legal mechanisms that were used to define racial categories, like, for example, including Negroes as a category and other non-white groups that are singled out and picked out in our statistics, support the identification and management of those communities. And it defines their rights, it limits immigration and settlement and controlling populations historically. For example, identifying people to apply the Chinese head tax, identifying citizens to intern during World War II, Japanese citizens specifically. So we have a few examples here of how legislation has defined people, has been used to define people regardless of how they define themselves, created categories that determine people's outcomes. And in order to impose on them a certain way of life, for example, through residential school. And we're familiar with residential schools as it impacts Indigenous peoples, but less familiar is the use of segregated schools on Black communities in Ontario. In fact, Ontario was one of two provinces in Canada where we had officially sanctioned segregated schools for Black children. So this history has really shaped how our society functions and how our systems are created. Our systems were created for the benefit and advantage of one particular group of people. I say that acknowledging that the white population is a very diverse population, but if you were defined as white, then you tended to have greater advantages in the way the systems were designed and functions for you. But if you were non-white, if you were Black, if you were Indigenous, if you were Asian, then you experienced the system in different ways. It wasn't designed for you or with you in mind. And so this is where we get to the idea of race as a structure. Most people are more familiar of racial discrimination as interpersonal, right? Like individual prejudice, the stereotypes and discriminatory behaviors that individuals might enact and behave towards one another. But going beyond that, and much more wide-ranging and wide-reaching implications and impacts is the systemic racial discrimination. So this is defined by the Ontario Human Rights Commission as patterns of behavior, policies, or practices that are part of the structures of an organization and which create or perpetuate disadvantage for racialized persons. It doesn't have to be intentional. You don't need racist people to have systemic racial discrimination present. In fact, our systems chugging along as it was designed to do will be sufficient to result in unequal outcomes because of the historical trails that lead us here. Systemic racism. So while systemic racial discrimination is the what, right? It's the patterns of behaviors, policies, and practices that result in disadvantage. For racialized persons, systemic racism is the how. How did we get to those patterns? And it's described by the Anti-Racism Directorate as when institutions or systems create or maintain inequitable policies and practices as a result of hidden institutional racial biases that privilege some groups and disadvantage others. So race operates to make individuals both hyper-visible and invisible. So they're made visible through surveillance technologies and practices, through bureaucratic data and statistics that focuses on communities and certain populations, usually from a negative perspective, not from a strength-based perspective, but rather from a deficit-based perspective. So you can think about how much we know about crime rates among certain communities, but we know very little about crime rates among other communities. And I challenge you to think about, how much or if you've ever thought about what are the crime rates among Italians or among German descent. We don't know because we don't report about those, but we're very interested in what the crime rates are among the Black community, for example. So that's an example of what I mean by bureaucratic data and statistics to make certain groups hyper visible and then targeted for control and enforcement as a result. And then we make certain communities, racialized communities, Indigenous communities, invisible through omission and exclusion in data. What doesn't get counted doesn't count, right? There's exclusion in our media and in our cultures. We've erased histories of the contributions of Black and Indigenous communities to Canadian politics and Canadian culture and economy. We know very little about that. It's invisible through omission at the decision-making tables. And what that leads to is a lack of fair treatment opportunities to participate in social, economic, and political life. So if we look at Toronto, because I'm in Toronto. But we can look at any major city in Canada through this lens, at the way that racial inequities are baked into our infrastructures and into our systems. And the data could have information about race, but it could also, but you don't need race to, to identify and see how systems and structures encode race regardless. So data can become proxies for race without even mentioning race. So this map here, which was created by Esmond Lee, and he's done a number of really nice looking maps of Toronto, looking at income and immigrant status inequalities in Toronto. You can see the distribution of income, individual income across the city. So you can see in the center, of the city here, tends to be very concentrated wealth, higher individual income. And then you see at the edges here and along the downtown core here, higher poverty, low income. And if you were to layer this map with a map of where racialized and Black communities live, you will see that it aligns almost exactly, right? And so what you have is the cumulative impacts of a history of urban planning policies, of economic labor market policies and trends that have reduced the ability of certain communities to afford housing in certain parts of the city. It has led to overcrowding situations that disproportionately impact racialized Torontonians. And this was recently the result of the study that was published by Social Planning Toronto. And David Hulchinski's research found that Toronto was not so much a city of neighborhoods. We like to think of ourselves as a city of neighborhoods, and we have some really cool neighborhoods to boost. But it's really, we can also think about it as a city of disparities. And what we've seen since the 70s, and the trend continues today, is increasing polarization, increasing income inequality, and increasing ethnocultural segregation as well. And that is so spatially defined and imprinted onto the city. So what this means is that people's choices and our relationships and our interactions with the physical environment and our movement through it is really, there's a huge structural component to it. And so we have to be mindful of that, of the context and the history that has resulted in these patterns we will see through our data. If you're mining data from whatever source and you're looking at it without understanding the context and the historical and local context for how, and understanding how this data was generated and what may be what are the factors that drive the data to look a certain way and who's omitted from that data, then we fail to appreciate the fact that systemic barriers and systemic racial disparities exist, and we fail to act upon it, and we fail to make decisions so that we get the kind of city that we want, and we get the kinds of services that we want, and not simply just to replicate or amplify inequalities more efficiently. So this is where we get to, we talked about systemic racism. And so I want to talk about anti-racism as a proactive course of action. We are never going to address and be able to understand and unpack and mitigate and reduce and eliminate systemic racism without intent in everything that we do. And so as a proactive course of action, we we have to understand that data is not a reality on the one hand, but data can reflect our current systems. That means taking an evidence-based approach through intentional values-driven actions. And recognizing that technical fixes are not the answer and they are not enough. They can be an answer, they can be a tool, but they are not enough. What we need is widespread cultural change and a shift in mindset in order to build ethics and equity into our tech tools and build in the processes to ensure that we get a strong accountability, transparency mechanisms, and demand regulations so that everyone's playing by the same rules and we don't end up rewarding companies that develop tech tools by prioritizing speed and efficiency over efficacy and the public good. So what we have currently today in terms of equity and building in some guardrails are human rights legislation like the Human Rights Code in Ontario and the Anti-Racism Act, its regulation and data standards. So while the Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination, so it's a very reactionary kind of model, right? And it's very case specific. So you bring specific cases to tribunal in order to seek remedies to discriminatory practices and hold individual organizations accountable. The Anti-Racism Act allows and creates and enables tools and requires the government to actually be proactive about it. So finding ways to identify and address it before it becomes a big problem. And so you kind of need the two together. You need a remedial system, but you also need an enabling framework to allow us to address it. So the regulations under the Anti-Racism Act, and this would be exciting to those who work with data and who are excited to see this data and have the data to help us identify systemic barriers and systemic disparities. The Anti-Racism Act, under the Anti-Racism Act, anti-racism data standards were developed and established to require specific public sector organizations that are named in the regulation to collect race-based data in their services. So that includes school boards have been mandated to collect race-based data, Children's Aid Society, as well as the justice sector. So that includes bail courts, youth, adult corrections, and police services to collect race-based data for the purposes of identifying, monitoring, and addressing systemic racism and racial barriers in their programs, services, and the functions that they provide. That means connecting the race data with the outcomes and taking a systems focus. Not stigmatize communities. So this is about what our systems do and its impacts on people. Outside of that, in terms of data protections and preventing misuse, there's a lot of criticisms about whether our privacy regime is up to the task, particularly with rapidly growing and evolving data ecosystem that we have today. The federal government signaled plans to consult about a digital charter and introduce an enhanced bill to enhance the protection of Canadians' privacy and digital rights. So I really encourage you to be part of that conversation so that we get it, so that they can get it right. So whatever the tool is that you are designing and building, it's critical to ask who could be harmed and who is not benefiting from this tool. It requires building equity and ethics into all aspects of data practices, from the beginning, from inception of the idea to the end, meaning continuing to monitor its impacts on different populations. and taking a targeted universalism approach. A targeted universalism approach means that when you develop systems that work and serve for the benefit of the most vulnerable group, the most vulnerable individual, then what you end up with is a system and a tool that will work for everybody, right? And so an example I like to think about, this concept of universal, targeted universalism is that when you're designing, for example, accessible entrances, right? The ramp that leads to a door that's automatically opens when it detects someone in front of it, and it's accessible, so it should be, it should register someone regardless of their height. I'm short, so I sometimes have to jump to get to register. But if you have a good system that's accessible, guess what? Everyone benefits. The parents with the stroller benefits. The person with the cane or a person with a broken leg benefits from that. So even though you design it for a wheelchair, you end up broadening your reach and benefiting much more than that. Consider the purpose. Build equity and ethics into the purpose of the tool. Build values into the tool. Articulate what values your tool expresses and encode that into the work. And that means working with communities to ensure that there are no built-in assumptions that are harmful to the user, that are not true, and that are inaccurate. It means consulting with clients and communities and civil society groups to define what those values are and whether the tool is even, what purpose it serves, whether it is even desirable from a public interest perspective, not just from a private consumer user perspective. Do the assessment and the planning around what data is available that you will be using, whether you have to collect your own data, whether you're using available data that's out there, and understanding what that data means. So really understanding your data set and its limitations. And testing for risks, right? Building that into your processes. So building testing and engagement into your timelines, making sure that the resources available, whatever the funding package looks like to support the project, that there's dedicated funds available for that. And that's critical for transparency, for accountability, to promote efficacy and legitimacy of your tools. Having in place practices that can support community capacity to understand what it is you're developing and to be involved and have the opportunity to be involved to support and build up digital literacy and also awareness of the tool. Building in equal participation in decision making. So we have examples of, for example, in the budgetary process in Toronto, of having a participatory budgeting process as an example, allowing communities to determine which projects deserve and should be allocated funds from the city to develop. And beyond the technical education, if you are involved with universities and colleges or have influence over decisions around what a technical education looks like in your areas, insist on ethics being embedded in teaching everywhere in every course, not just a standalone course where it's mandatory, you take it, and then you're done with it. Ethics should be embedded in every single aspect of your education and of the education that future generations who are learning about machine learning and artificial intelligence should take. Encouraging interdisciplinary projects and community action research so that's part of building respectful partnerships with communities, as well as encouraging, a broader scope and expanding the imagination through, interdisciplinary pursuits, like encouraging, the study of history, sociology, arts, languages. We need to expand our imagination of what is possible and a utopian view of tools, but with our eyes wide open to the limitations of technology as well, to that imagination. So often when we talk about ethics, we talk about transparency, accountability, privacy, consent, guarding against bias and misuse. But we need to think about equity in terms of, inclusion. Who is at the table? Who is not? Whose voices and perspectives are heard? Ensuring that there's agency and control in the use of our tools. So oftentimes, we make tools to help decision makers make use of and make sense of data and all this data to help them make decisions. But oftentimes we forget that, because of the time pressures and the expectations for that are placed on decision makers to make timely decisions, we lean on those tools too much to make sense, when we have to be careful to maintain our agency as decision makers and allow individuals to take control over their data and the outcomes, the scores that are created about them. So allowing people to question the algorithm and the conclusions those algorithms make about them, and correcting those things. Being responsive to community needs as well. And algorithmic justice is this concept that's being discussed. How can we use tech tools and algorithms to undo the built-in biases within our systems, to actually counter it, right? And so, those are questions and pursuits that to think about. So I provide a few links and resources that I thought was really, really helpful if you guys are curious about and want to learn more. I absolutely recommend going to the Anti-Racism Data Standards so that you can understand how public sector organizations that are mandated under the Anti-Racism Act is collecting this data and what's required of them, so that you have a better sense of what the data involves. That's being collected. And, the exciting thing is that the Anti-Racism Act requires that data collected by these public sector organizations take an open government approach. That means that the open data enables communities to use and benefit from the information that's being collected, anonymized, de-identified, of course, and also to generate robust conversations about trends and systemic barriers that are that may be identified. That means that there's going to be a lot of public sector data that will be coming out soon as a result. We All Count is a fantastic website with that's accessible. It's resourceful, and it has a points you to some community-based projects to better understand ethics and equity in data. Equality Project is out of the University of Ontario, and University of Ottawa, and it has a dedicated and it's dedicated to young people. So understanding youth's use of digital tools and technology and the impacts that it has on them. I also recommend the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. They produce a lot of research summaries and policy research around the broad area of ethics in AI, and that's a great source for information. insights, as well as the Algorithmic Justice League, which is focused out of the US, but a fantastic group of leaders and thinkers in this area, and how to promote AI for the benefit of communities and mitigate against its most harmful impacts. I also share a few recommended readings for those who really want to get in depth into these issues. Don't read them all consecutively because it gets quite depressing, but very insightful, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read some of them already. So that's it. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Phan. That was very
discussion.
insightful, and I echo the sentiment of the attendees of this presentation. The discussion of race is such a critical topic, especially in the data science community. So we have a couple questions. So let's start with, I think some of them were asked during the talk. So I guess we could just, I think some of them might have been answered, but I guess we could reiterate it. So are research institutions included in the list of organizations that collect race data for anti-racism purposes?
Research institutions, no. So under the Anti-Racism Act, the footprint to which the Anti-Racism Act can apply is quite broad. It's pretty much includes any organization that receives more than $1 million of funding from the provincial government could be captured under the footprint and regulated. But right now, the regulation is, so it could include universities, for example. But right now, the regulations are focused on school boards, children's aid societies across Ontario, the Ministry of Attorney General in bail courts to understand bail decisions and any disparate impacts of bail decisions, youth and adult corrections. So that includes both custody and community service, probation, parole. And it includes the Ministry of, the Ontario Independent Police Review Director that takes in public complaints about police services, as well as the Special Investigation Unit and their investigations of deaths involving police. And then I mentioned police services through the Ministry of the Solicitor General in use of force forums. So that's the scope right now, and those areas were the initial focus for regulation because of the push by community to understand the school to prison pipeline, the child welfare system to prison pipeline, and what happens to people in the criminal justice system. We know those are huge areas of concerns for community. We know the problems exist. We just don't have, we just don't have the data to really understand and unpack where exactly is contributing to those disparities. And by having the data, it holds decision makers accountable as well. Without data, all we have is, that's anecdotal evidence. But with robust data, and I'm not saying we should not take action until the data are available. I think we should critically take action right now because we know the problems are real. But the data will help us will be like a smoke alarm, right? It's going to tell us if we're going in the right direction or not. Are we moving the metric or not? And I think it's that accountability piece that will be really critical.
Related to that, right now we're talking a lot about the public sector and what falls under it, but there are also a lot of private organizations that are moving towards collecting race-based data. Are there anything in place right now to ensure that the data is being used in a more equitable manner?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that I've, that concerns me on the one hand, but on the other hand, having the data out as open data, obviously privacy protected by being de-identified. And I know that's not a perfect solution, and there are issues with that as well, because we still risk the people drawing from that data and making conclusions that are either wrong or are used to harm and stigmatize communities even further. The benefits of having open data, though, is that because that data is out for everybody, it allows us to counter those narratives using data, right? And I think transparency and sunlight is the best cure, I guess, not cure, but prevention of misuse, because then we can have that robust debate. We've been having, this debate without data. And so people are just, drawing their own conclusions with no evidence whatsoever. And so with data, hopefully that will constrain and put parameters around an informed conversation, as opposed to conjectures and whatnot. So that's my hope for open data. And the anti-racism data standards provides guidelines around how to think about and approach the collection of race-based data. And again, even though it's focused on race-based data, we can extend it to any other kind of identity data, social justice data. But private, because it's a policy guideline, private sector organizations and research institutes, if they're interested, can kind of look to that, with consistent data across different sectors, that will really enhance our ability to understand big trends and a whole of government approach to understanding systemic barriers, because we know organizations don't work in silos and on their own, right? There are impacts from other sectors, impacts, of in every area of our life that kind of accumulates to create a whole mess of of things for people. I don't know if that answers the question, but there's no way we can guarantee the desired purpose will be met.
Following up on that, at the federal government level in Canada, there's an algorithmic assessment checklist. Is there something equivalent in on the city of Toronto?
That I don't know. Yeah, that's a great question. But I know City Council right now is debating a data for equity strategy. And so I look forward to those debates to hear what might come out of an equity for data strategy, and whether that would include an algorithmic assessment checklist.
There is one on, is there any plans to mix policing data with data from external to police, i.e., for example, like health data?
Excellent question. So right now, no. There are I don't know if you're familiar with FIPA Part 3 changes that were introduced recently that allows for data integration units at the ministry level and inter-ministry level. And so that could be a possibility in the future. I'm not quite clear exactly what has been approved, but I do know right now it's ministry level data, and certain types of information could be shared within the ministry in different areas. So for example, the Ministry of Solicitor General, and this is hypothetical, I don't know the details of it, but for example, the Ministry of Solicitor General has data, carriage over data collected in the corrections facilities and probation offices. And then they also have carriage over OPP and over other public safety areas like fire and whatnot, fire services and whatnot. And so the Ministry of Solicitor General, as a data integration unit, could potentially merge those different data together. Whether they plan to or not, I don't know. But that is one area of possibility. But in terms of individual police services, there is no plans right now to mix the data unless it's part of a program in which police are partnering with mental health providers for specific services like the mental crisis intervention unit team, that they, if they collectively collect data as part of that program, then in a sense, health and police data would be merged. But right now, there's very strict privacy requirements that
you mentioned earlier about how
the
strategy for private sector is, the ultimate goal is to be as open and transparent about it. So the city of Amsterdam maintains an algorithm register. Do you think the city of Toronto has plans to publishing a similar register?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I don't know. Yeah, I can't speak for the city of Toronto,
okay.
But that's something somebody should follow up on for sure.
Answered the last question. It basically said, what about mixing between ministries and between public institutions? I think you mentioned policing and health data only happens at a limited basis since there is a lot of privacy involved. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and we have to recognize that health data also has its own privacy framework, the PHIPAA, and so it really limits and also what do you mean by health data? Also affects what information can be shared and mixed. But I think understanding that intersection between race and mental health, gender identity, homelessness, socioeconomic marginalization. I think those are all really critical to help us understand, what impact policing has on different populations and how to police in a more equitable manner so that everybody experiences, same level of community safety and well-being.
That should be all the questions. Oh, we have one more. Can you comment on the ethical issues related to COVID-19 data access by Toronto Police Services?
I don't know too much. I'm not really involved with the. I am familiar with the COVID-19 data access, and my understanding is that TPS is no longer have access to that data, and certainly that was something that should have been considered at the very beginning and not after things blow up. But sometimes you need things to blow up in order for us just like, ooh, okay, maybe that wasn't the approach. And that's where the call to really think from the very beginning when you're thinking about doing something, to consider what are the implications of this, especially for really marginalized populations and vulnerable populations, and thinking it through really carefully before we act. And oftentimes we prioritize speed and efficiency over ethics and safety, right? And I think that's a bigger problem within the way we operate as a society in general.
Given the circumstances, it was a big time crunch in kind of making the right decisions, and it is difficult with the time constraints to see everything. But so the last question I think is, are you aware of the concerns that have been raised about race data, for example, in the G&M column recently?
Is that the Ronaldo Walcott wrote about, is that the article he wrote recently about needing to use race data? Like it's race data on its own is not, absolutely. And so, one of the things, we have to be really careful about this whole, race data will solve everything. No, it will not. Race data is just a tool. And like any tool, it has been misused. And maybe that's not the right word, because at the time it was used for that purpose, right? And thinking back now, we're thinking, wow, that was that was morally wrong from where we sit now. But at the time, they felt like that was their framework and that was their worldview. And so race data is used for the purpose for which we use it. And so we have to be really vigilant. And this is where open data can be helpful, so that the community now has that tool too, and can ensure that race data is used properly to benefit communities, to challenge stigmatization, and organizations who are collecting that data, particularly under the Anti-Racism Act, because the act itself triggers the IPC's responsibility and enforcement role towards those public sector organizations. And so it gives the power to hold organizations accountable when they are collecting the data and then not using that data for the purpose for which it's collected, which is to identify, monitor, and address systemic racism. So if it's not being used to make decisions, equitable decisions, if it's not being used for that purpose, then the organization is in violation of the law. And so that's one of the the powers of the ARA. Once open data is out there,
so
community can be involved in
one of the
holding those organizations accountable as well.
Was that, are we monitoring race or monitoring racism right now?
Excellent question. Thank you so much for asking it. And this is, I can't emphasize enough. Race is not real. What we are measuring when we're measuring race, by understanding the genesis, and that's why I started this talk with kind of, laying out the genesis of that idea, is that we are really measuring racism. And by asking people, what is your race? Well, we're not saying that that's something real about you. It's rather to have people kind of identify how they've been categorized and whether that categorization, that racialization, and anybody who's racialized knows how you are racialized, whether you think of yourself that way or not, right? Because of your experiences of discrimination, that offhand comments, the microaggressions you experience. And so what we're really, really measuring is racism. And being critical about the construct and the data that's being collected, how organizations collect that data will help us to understand when we're interpreting the results, interpreting the scores that an algorithm spits out, whether it is replicating the racism that the person experiences and the systemic racial barriers that intergenerational trauma and the intergenerational aspects of it. And it's not about them. It's about how they experience systems and how that impacts their outcomes. And so that's the systems focus direction that's behind the anti-racism data standards.
Yep. I think that should be all the questions for today. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Pham, and giving us such an important and insightful presentation. I hope to hopefully see you at other talks as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this opportunity. And awesome. I would be happy to share the slide with the group.
Great day.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.